The air was thick with tension and the stench of sickness. Bacon lay in his bed, his face pale and his body weak. The room was dim, the only light coming from a flickering candle on the bedside table. George, his loyal friend and protégé, stood by his side, his eyes filled with concern. He had visited Bacon several times, trying to offer comfort and support. When the parliamentary hearings against Bacon began, George bravely spoke in his defense, even though it seemed like a lost cause. In the final vote, George was the only one among the lords who dared to dissent, a gesture that, though futile, spoke volumes about his loyalty. Bacon, once a powerful figure who had ruled England with the king's favor, was now nothing more than a shadow of his former self. He was exiled to Gorhambury, his quiet retreat in Hertfordshire, a far cry from the opulence of York House, the grand London residence he had once called home. The moment he was disgraced, his rivals pounced, each eager to claim his former glory. But George, with his sharp political acumen, managed to outmaneuver them all, securing York House for himself. He had learned well from his mentor, and now he stood as a rising star in the court, his future seemingly secure. But the court was a place of constant change and shifting alliances. In 1611, a young and ambitious George Villiers found himself at the center of a new drama. Prince Henry, the heir to the throne, was a charismatic and popular figure, known for his love of art and his athletic prowess. He had recently received a series of small bronze sculptures from the Grand Duke of Tuscany, each a masterpiece crafted by the Flemish sculptor Bologna. These bronzes, the first Renaissance sculptures to reach England, were displayed in a private gallery at St. James's Palace, a place of secret gardens and spiral staircases. When Henry first saw the collection, he couldn't resist the urge to touch and admire them. He picked one up, kissed it, and arranged them carefully in a cabinet. His younger brother, Charles, was different from Henry in every way. Charles was shorter, more fragile, and often struggled with his health. Despite their differences, Charles adored Henry, writing him letters and trying to impress him with his achievements. One day, while waiting in the presence chamber with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Henry playfully placed the primate's mitre on Charles's head, joking that he would make him archbishop when he became king. But beneath the laughter, there was a cruel edge to Henry's words, a reminder of the vast gap between them. Then tragedy struck. During the celebrations for his sister Elizabeth's wedding, Henry fell ill. Despite the efforts of his doctors, who tried everything from lenitive blisters to pigeon blood, his condition worsened. Charles, desperate to show his love, brought the miniature bronze horse from St. James's Palace and placed it in Henry's hand. But it was too late. Within a week, Henry was dead, and the nation mourned the loss of their beloved prince. The funeral cortege was a somber affair, and Charles, the new heir to the throne, barely received a second glance. The man who had once been Henry's shadow now stood in the spotlight, but the world seemed to have forgotten him. When he was installed as Prince of Wales in 1616, even the Bishop of Ely mistakenly called him Henry, a painful reminder of his brother's legacy. Charles's relationship with his father, King James, was strained. James, a man with his own insecurities, saw Henry as a rival and Charles as a disappointment. King's favor fell upon George Villiers, a young man who reminded him of Henry. Charles, desperate for attention, tried to win his father's approval, but he was often overlooked. One day, he admired a ring on George's finger and asked to borrow it. The next day, when George asked for it back, Charles claimed he had lost it. James, furious, scolded Charles so harshly that the prince burst into tears. The king forbade Charles from his presence until the ring was returned, a cruel reminder of his place in the royal hierarchy. Another incident further humiliated Charles. While walking in Greenwich Park with his father and George, Charles, in a moment of frustration, turned a fountain on George, soaking his expensive clothes. James, enraged, boxed Charles's ears in front of the entire court. It was a moment that would stay with Charles for a long time, a stark reminder of his father's favoritism and his own isolation. But change was on the horizon. In 1616, Francis Bacon, George's mentor, warned him about Charles. He advised George to take a more active role in the prince's education and well-being, for the good of the kingdom. George, initially preoccupied with his own ambitions, began to see the wisdom in Bacon's words. He realized that to secure his position in the court, he needed to build a relationship with Charles. The opportunity came in 1618, when James decided to celebrate George's promotion to marquis with a 12th night masque. Charles, determined to gain his father's attention, organized the event with great effort. The masque, titled Pleasure Reconciled to Virtue, was a grand affair with elaborate decorations and a performance by the renowned playwright Ben Jonson. The king's throne was placed under a canopy, and the hall was filled with nobles and diplomats, including the Spanish ambassador, the Conde de Gondomar. As the masque began, the air was electric with anticipation. Charles, dressed in his finest, watched from the sidelines, hoping that this moment would be the one where he finally won his father's approval. But the night was just beginning, and the court was a place of hidden agendas and shifting loyalties. George, now a favored figure, found himself at the center of a new storm, one that would test his loyalty and his ambition in ways he could never have imagined. The air in the grand hall was thick with excitement and anticipation, as the guests waited for the king and his honored guest to arrive. Bucino, a keen observer, noticed the opulence of the decorations and the beauty of the house, with its festoons and angels adorning the walls. He marveled at the 600 noble and richly dressed ladies, each one a vision of elegance. Some wore delicate plumes on their heads, while others carried them as fans. Their necks and bosoms were adorned with strings of jewels, and their girdles and apparel sparkled with gold and silver. Bucino also observed the variety in their attire. Some showed their bosoms liberally, while others were more modestly dressed in high collars. Despite their elaborate gowns, the women wore men's shoes or very low slippers, which seemed to amuse him. After a long wait, the sound of cornets and trumpets filled the hall, announcing the arrival of King James and his honored guest, Gondomar. James entered the hall and took his seat on the throne, with Gondomar placed on a stool next to him. The great officers of the crown and courts of law sat behind the king on benches. Then a large curtain dropped, revealing a tent made of gold cloth set in a field with a blue sky painted behind it, sprinkled with golden stars. A giant figure of Atlas appeared, with only his enormous head visible, moving cleverly. The entertainment began with a series of performances that captivated Bucino. 12 masked boys dressed as frogs danced, followed by a guitar player in a gown who sang trills. High priests with gilt mitres joined the spectacle, and then a dozen cavaliers in crimson hose and white satin doublets, trimmed with gold and silver lace, descended from the heavens in a pyramid formation with the prince at the top. They began to dance, maintaining the pyramid shape with a variety of steps. However, the Prince Charles struggled with his role. He ran out of breath quickly, and the audience became restless. King James, known for his quick temper, grew impatient and shouted, "Why don't they dance? What did they make me come here for? Devil take you all, dance." The mood in the hall turned tense, but then George, the new Marquis of Buckingham, sprang forward and performed a series of graceful and agile capers. His performance not only calmed the king, but also won the admiration of everyone in the hall. The cavaliers continued to dance, and the hall came alive with their performance. Despite the initial setback, the evening ended on a high note, and the bond between Charles and George grew stronger. This friendship was further cemented during a family argument over Queen Anne's will. Anne had fallen ill and summoned Charles to her bedside, suggesting she leave her jewels to him. The jewels were rumored to be worth an enormous sum, and James was furious when he learned of this. Charles wrote to George, who had become his close friend, for help. He explained that he had acted on a command from James to encourage the Queen to make a will. George, using his influence, arranged a feast to reconcile Charles with James. The king, moved by the event, drank a toast to his son and George, signaling their reconciliation. As the Christmas revels continued, Queen Anne lay in her sick, thinking about Charles's future. She had initially supported a Spanish match for him, influenced by her lady-in-waiting, Jane Drummond, who had close ties to the Spanish ambassador, Gondomar. However, Anne's support wavered, and she began to favor a French match, possibly due to the influence of her new page, Pierrot Hugon. Anne's health deteriorated, and in her final days, she switched her position again, urging Charles to pursue the Spanish match. On March 1st, 1619, Anne's condition worsened, and she lost her sight. Charles and her faithful maid Anna Ruse were at her bedside when she died. It was discovered that Hugon had stolen her jewels, which were found along with Catholic paraphernalia, revealing Anne's deep religious commitment. James's health also declined, and he summoned Charles George and leading members of his Privy Council to hear his final advice. He emphasized the importance of religion and justice, and urged Charles to pursue the Spanish match, despite his earlier advice to choose his own bride. The international situation was also in turmoil. The Archduke Ferdinand II had become the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Kingdom of Bohemia rose in rebellion against his rule. Frederick, the ruler of the Palatinate and husband of James's daughter Elizabeth, accepted the Bohemian crown, further complicating the political landscape. James, who had styled himself as the King of Peace, found himself in a difficult position, as his son-in-law's actions threatened to plunge Europe into war. George, now Lord Admiral of the fleet, advocated for military support for Frederick, and Charles, influenced by George, also supported this stance. However, James refused to take any action, leading to political gridlock and confusion. The French ambassador questioned James's mental state, noting that his timidity and old age had diminished his intelligence. James found himself torn between his family ties and his diplomatic commitments, and the situation remained unresolved as the political tensions continued to rise. James's spirits lifted when he learned that his old friend Diego Gondomar was returning to London. Philip III of Spain had decided to send his emissary shortly after Frederick's coronation in Prague. Gondomar, however, was reluctant to leave Spain, claiming he was still recovering from an illness that had forced him to leave London 2 years earlier. The matter of England requires someone who is healthy and robust, he told his masters. He was also concerned that peace with Britain might be allowing the country to grow stronger commercially and militarily at Spain's expense. Despite his objections, Gondomar set off in January 1620 and arrived in London in early March. He headed straight for Theobald's, where King James was staying. As they were waiting for the king, the floor gave way and several dignitaries, including the Earl of Arundel, fell into the room below. Gondomar, standing in a doorway, escaped unharmed and later wrote home, "The Puritans have tried and are trying to have me killed." Despite the mishap, the reunion of James and Gondomar was warm. James gently chided him for his absence, saying, "You look just like an old friend of mine, the Conde de Gondomar." Their private talks began with James explaining his predicament in a self-pitying tone. "When you shook Buckingham's hand, you squeezed his sore finger hard enough to hurt him," James said. He warned Gondomar not to squeeze so hard, as he, too, was tender. James had suffered from the mess in Bohemia, fearing it had ruined their efforts to bring Britain and Spain closer together. He took off his hat, wiped his forehead, and said, "I give you my word as a king, as a gentleman, as a Christian, and as an honest man, that I have no wish to marry my son to anyone except your master's daughter. I desire no alliance but that of Spain." Not everyone was happy about Gondomar's return. The night he arrived, battle drums were beaten in the streets to summon volunteers to help Frederick and Elizabeth in Bohemia. The next morning, a placard was nailed to Gondomar's door, inviting men to enlist to fight Spanish tyranny. The Venetian ambassador noted that Protestants and the general public viewed Gondomar with jaundiced eyes. People were already making bitter speeches and harsh remarks about the peace between the kingdoms if the marriage took place. Elizabeth wrote to George, thanking him for his support and asking him to persuade her father to help Frederick and her. In June, an open letter began circulating in London, criticizing previous unions between England and Spain and urging George to use his influence to oppose the Spanish match. In November, news reached London that Frederick and Elizabeth had been deposed. Imperial troops had defeated Frederick's forces just outside Prague in the Battle of the White Mountain. Frederick and Elizabeth fled to The Hague with only the Bohemian crown jewels. The reaction in London was intense. People were seen and heard expressing anger and grief. James, who was in Newmarket, was very sad and grieved, and stayed in his room, forbidding his courtiers from any games or recreation. The situation grew worse in October 1621, when Sir John Digby, James's ambassador in Madrid, returned from Vienna. He reported his humiliation and called for war to restore honor and the Palatinate to the Stuart line. The council called for immediate retaliation, but James played for time. He agreed to send £40,000 to Frederick and decided to recall Parliament to raise more money. The court was confused and frustrated. James, known for his peacemaking, had a secret plan. He reconciled with George and Charles, and drew them into a strategy to satisfy all parties. James argued that if Charles married into the Spanish royal family, Philip might pressure the Holy Roman Emperor to restore the Palatinate peacefully. Parliament was recalled in late November. On 24 November, Digby repeated his angry denunciation of the Holy Roman Emperor before both houses, urging MP to raise £900,000 for a relief force. James met Gondomer privately to explain that Digby's allegations were to shift focus away from Spain to the Duke of Bavaria. He also revealed a plan to dissolve Parliament if it threatened war with Spain. A few days later, intercepted letters between the Holy Roman Emperor and the King of Spain, Philip IV, were handed to James. These showed that Philip IV was nervous about the emperor's stance. James acted quickly. George sent a message to Sir George Goring, his parliamentary proxy, to introduce a motion that the House should declare that if Philip IV did not stop supporting the emperor, they would declare war on Spain. Goring, known for his jokes and lack of seriousness, delivered the speech. Parliament was confused and suspicious. The MP referred the matter to a committee. Goring's intervention unleashed a wave of anti-Spanish and anti-Papist sentiment. James had hoped for a simple motion for war against the emperor, but the MP added clauses against Catholics and the Spanish match. Charles was incensed and wrote to George, asking for a commission to deal with the MP. James obliged, dismissing Parliament and tearing out the page from the Commons Journal carrying the protestation. The initial signs were that James's gamble had failed. Gondomer suggested breaking off relations and returning to Madrid. However, within a few months, relations with Spain began to improve. In early 1622, James sent Digby back to Madrid to resume the marriage negotiations. News arrived that Philip IV wanted Gondomer back in Madrid, and James gave his blessing to the recall. Just before Gondomer left, he dined with James, Charles, and George at Greenwich. James was visibly moved and gave Gondomer a diamond ring, making him promise to return. Charles also gave him a ring and, in great secrecy, told Gondomer that he was prepared to go to Madrid incognito to woo the Infanta. Gondomer saw this as a sign of Charles's sincerity, and even thought he might convert to Catholicism. Since the crisis, Charles had transformed from a timid, hesitant prince into a passionate and assertive champion of the Spanish match. He had become the embodiment of his father's foreign policy and the country's hope for success. The day was chilly, and the sky was a deep shade of gray as Prince Charles and George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, set out on their daring adventure. They were disguised as Tom and John Smith, but their hearts were racing with excitement and fear. They had a mission: to secure the Spanish match and maybe even gain some allies in the ongoing struggle for the Palatinate. It was a risky plan, and King James, Charles's father, had been hesitant to let them go. But the prince and his favorite had used every trick in the book to win him over. They reminded James of his own romantic escapades, like when he had sailed to Norway to fetch his bride, Queen Anne. James, despite his worries, finally gave in, moved by the love and determination of his son and his closest friend. The journey began on a cold February morning. Sir Francis Coddington and Endymion Porter, who were in on the secret, were tasked with preparing the way. Coddington, however, was deeply concerned. He feared the risks and the lack of proper security, but George and Charles were determined. They left Theobald's, the royal residence, and headed for New Hall, George's home in Essex. The next day they slipped away, dressed in false beards and accompanied by Sir Richard Graham, a man from the Scottish borders. The first leg of the journey was to Dover, where they would cross the English Channel, but things didn't go smoothly. In Gravesend, they had to cross the Thames estuary by ferry. Neither Charles nor George had small change, so they paid with a large gold coin. This raised suspicions, and the ferryman reported them to the authorities in Rochester. They managed to escape by taking a cross-country route, leaping over hedges to avoid being recognized. In Canterbury, they faced another challenge. The mayor, who had been tipped off, tried to arrest them. George, quick on his feet, revealed his identity as the Lord Admiral, and claimed they were on a secret mission to review the royal fleet. This bluff worked, and they were allowed to continue. Finally, they reached Dover, where they met Porter and Coddington. The weather was stormy, and George, who was notoriously seasick, suffered through the rough crossing to Boulogne. Once on French soil, they abandoned their disguises and headed for Paris. But just outside the city, they were recognized by two German tourists who had seen them in Newmarket. Graham, the brawny bodyguard, had to convince them they were mistaken, which, given the absurdity of the situation, was surprisingly easy. In Paris, they faced a new problem. James had sent a message instructing them to inform the French king of their arrival. This was a serious diplomatic issue, and they were reluctant to follow the king's advice. However, James, in a letter that mixed affection with sternness, reminded them that they couldn't remain hidden for long. The French ambassador had already caught wind of their journey, and James had to write to Louis XIII to explain the situation. Despite this, George and Charles decided to stay incognito, and even bought periwigs to hide their faces. They spent the day sightseeing in Paris, relishing the freedom of being ordinary travelers. But the weight of their mission was always on their minds. They knew that the success of the Spanish match and the fate of the Palatinate were in their hands. As they left Paris and continued their journey south, they were determined to make their daring plan work, no matter the risks. As the sun set over Madrid, Sir John Digby sat in his chamber, reflecting on the whirlwind of events that had just unfolded. Just a few hours ago, he had been blindsided by the arrival of the Marquis of Buckingham, George Villiers, and Prince Charles, who had arrived unannounced and in disguise. The news that the prince was in Madrid, seeking to secure a marriage alliance with the Spanish Infanta, was a shock that reverberated through the halls of the House of the Seven Chimneys. George, always the charmer, had quickly taken charge, insisting that they reveal Charles to King Philip IV as soon as possible. Despite his initial dismay, Digby knew that the mission's success now hinged on their ability to navigate the complex web of Spanish court politics. With speed and secrecy, they orchestrated a meeting with the powerful Conde d'Olivers, the king's chief minister. The Count Duke, though initially irritated by the disruption, was intrigued by the audacity of the English visitors. In a private audience, George's charm and Charles's determination seemed to soften the Habsburg reserve, and the Spanish court began to warm to the idea of a potential alliance. The next day, Charles was given his first glimpse of the Infanta Maria. Hidden in an invisible coach, he watched as the royal procession passed by. The Infanta, a vision of grace and beauty, caught his eye, and for a moment the world seemed to stand still. The prince's heart raced, and he knew that this was the woman he wanted to marry, regardless of the political costs. However, the road ahead was far from smooth. The Spanish court was a minefield of intrigue and protocol, and Charles's presence in Madrid was a breach of diplomatic norms. The negotiations for the marriage alliance were fraught with complications, particularly over the issue of the Infanta's Catholic faith and the need for a papal dispensation. Despite the challenges, George and Charles remained determined, their bond of friendship and shared adventure only growing stronger. As the days turned into weeks, the English visitors navigated the complexities of the Spanish court with a mix of charm and diplomacy. George, with his wit and influence, became a key figure in the negotiations, while Charles, though often overshadowed by his friend, was steadfast in his pursuit of the Infanta. The Spanish, impressed by the prince's sincerity and the Marquis's charisma, began to see the potential benefits of an alliance with England. Yet, the mission was not without its risks. News of Charles's presence in Madrid had spread, and the Spanish court was a place where a single misstep could lead to disaster. The prince's indiscretion with Queen Anne of France, while a distant memory, still haunted him, and the Spanish were wary of any hint of impropriety. Despite these challenges, the English visitors pressed on, driven by a sense of duty and a shared vision of a future alliance that could reshape the balance of power in Europe. In the end, the mission to Madrid was a testament to the power of friendship, determination, and the occasional dash of daring. Though the negotiations were far from over, and the path to a marriage alliance remained uncertain, Charles and George had already made history. They had crossed borders, defied expectations, and proven that even the most unlikely of missions could be transformed into a story of triumph and adventure. As the sun set over the Alcazar, the prince and the Marquis stood together, looking out over the city. The future was uncertain, but they had already achieved something remarkable. They had brought a ray of light to the dark and complex world of European diplomacy, and in doing so, had forged a bond that would endure for years to come.